Small towns often carry an air of quiet charm. Narrow streets lined with aging brick buildings, friendly waves from strangers, and that feeling of safety were the things I thought of when I first rolled into Fairfield. But as it turns out, the heart of a small town can conceal secrets darker than I'd ever imagined. Secrets that linger long after you've left, sinking claws into your memories like a shadow that refuses to fade. It all began last autumn. I was invited to Fairfield, a town tucked away in the folds of misty hills, to speak at their annual book festival. As a writer, I've grown accustomed to strange encounters. People often share ghost stories with me as if they're handing me their burdens. I usually dismiss them as imaginative embellishments, fuel for my next tale. But Fairfield was different. The festival went smoothly. I gave my lecture, signed books, and even answered the repetitive, "Where do you get your ideas from?" questions with my usual humor. As the day faded into night, one of the event organizers, a reserved man named Jacob, approached me. "There's something you should see," he said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. I raised an eyebrow. "Something? Like what?" "It's about the old mill on the outskirts of town. Locals say it's cursed, but I think it's more than that. I've read your work. You seem like someone who'd understand." I hesitated. This was exactly the sort of thing I usually avoided. Yet, something in Jacob's tone, a mix of urgency and dread, piqued my curiosity. "All right," I said. Jacob picked me up from my motel just before midnight. His car, a battered pickup, grumbled along the dirt road that led to the mill. As we drove, he told me about the place. The mill had been abandoned for decades after a string of gruesome accidents in the early 1900s. Workers would vanish, only for their bodies to turn up days later in the woods, mangled beyond recognition. The townsfolk believed the mill was cursed and eventually shuttered it, letting nature reclaim its rusting frame. "They say you can still hear them sometimes," Jacob said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "The workers, screaming." I rolled my eyes, though I couldn't deny the chill creeping up my spine. "And you've heard these screams yourself?" Jacob didn't answer immediately. "I've heard something," he said finally. The mill loomed ahead like a skeleton against the moonlit sky. Its shattered windows stared at us, empty and accusing. Jacob parked the car, and we stepped into the cold night air. The ground was soft with decaying leaves, muffling our footsteps as we approached the building. My flashlight carved a narrow path through the darkness, illuminating rusted machinery and sagging walls covered in graffiti. "Here," Jacob whispered, leading me toward a staircase. Up there, the stairs creaked under our weight, threatening to collapse with every step. At the top, we entered a cavernous room where the air felt heavier, colder. "Look," Jacob said, pointing toward a far corner. At first, I saw nothing. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I noticed something etched into the floor symbols, crude and jagged, radiating an unsettling energy. "Kids messing around?" I ventured, though my voice sounded unsure, even to me. Jacob shook his head. "These symbols have been here for years. No one knows who made them or what they mean." As we stood there, a low hum filled the air, growing louder, resonating in my chest. I turned to Jacob, but his face was frozen in terror, his gaze fixed on something behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam trembling as it cut through the dark. And then I saw Ita figure, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its facer, where its face should have been, was a featureless void, blacker than the shadows around it. "Run," Jacob choked out. And run we did. The thing didn't chase us, not physically, at least, but I swear, I felt its presence clinging to me like a second skin all the way back to the car. Jacob refused to talk on the drive back, his hands trembling on the wheel. As for me, I couldn't shake the image of that figure from my mind. The next day, I tried to act normal, pretending the events of the night before were some kind of fever dream. But as I sat in the coffee shop, flipping through local history books, I came across a photograph that froze my blood. It was a grainy black and white image of the mill, taken during its operational years. In the background, barely visible, was the same figure I'd seen in the mill. I stared at the photograph, my hands trembling slightly, as I traced the outline of the shadowy figure in the background. It wasn't a trick of the light or a smear on the photoid was there, its unnaturally tall frame unmistakable. My coffee sat untouched, growing cold as my mind raced. "Everything all right, hon?" The waitress's voice jolted me from my thoughts. I looked up to see her studying me, with a concerned frown, her pen hovering over her notepad. She was older, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that somehow felt comforting in that moment. "Do you know much about the old mill?" I asked, trying to sound casual as I gestured toward the photo in the book. Her expression shifted immediately. The warmth in her eyes dimmed, replaced by something darker. "You've been out there, haven't you?" I hesitated, then nodded. She sighed, setting her notepad down on the counter. "Let me give you some advice. Whatever you think you saw, whatever you think you know, forget it. That place has been nothing but trouble for this town." I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "You've seen it too, haven't you? The figure in the mill?" Her gaze darted around the room before she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "We call it the Tall One. My grandmother used to say it was a punishment, a shadow left behind by the mill's first owner. They say he was a cruel man, worked his employees to death, quite literally. When the workers revolted, they hung him from the rafters. Only he didn't stay dead." A chill crawled down my spine. The waitress shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You should leave town while you still can." I didn't leave. Something about the mill's story had its hooks in me, and I couldn't walk away without uncovering the truth. That night, I found myself sitting in my motel room, poring over old newspaper clippings and books about Fairfield's history. There were dozens of stories about the mill accidents, disappearances, even fires that seemed to start from nowhere, and always, in the background of those grainy photographs, was the shadowy figure. The last documented incident was in the late 1970s. A group of teenagers had snuck into the mill on a dare. Only one of them made it out, babbling incoherently about the shadow and the screams. He vanished a week later, his body never found. Around midnight, there was a knock at my door. I froze, the unease in my stomach coiling tighter. Slowly, I approached and peered through the peephole. It was Jacob. I opened the door, and he stumbled in, his face pale and slick with sweat. "It followed me," he whispered, his voice trembling. "What are you talking about?" I asked, shutting the door behind him. "The Tall One," he said. "I saw it outside my house. It was just standing there, watching me." My blood ran cold. "How do you know it's here?" Jacob's eyes darted to the window. "Because it's outside right now." We both turned to the window. At first, I saw nothing but the empty parking lot, bathed in the sickly glow of a flickering streetlight. Then, just beyond the edge of the light, I saw it. The Tall One. It stood perfectly still, its elongated limbs almost blending into the shadows. There was no face, no eyes, and yet I felt its gaze boring into me. Jacob grabbed my arm. "We have to get out of here." The next few hours were a blur of panic and adrenaline. We drove aimlessly, putting as much distance as possible between us and the motel. It wasn't until we reached the edge of town that we finally stopped. Jacob was shaking, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "It won't stop," he muttered. "It doesn't stop." I placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll figure this out, but we need to know what we're dealing with." He turned to me, his eyes hollow. "You don't understand. The Tall One. It's not just in the mill, it's in the town." As dawn broke, we found ourselves at the town library, poring over ancient records and obscure texts. What we uncovered painted a horrifying picture. The mill's original owner, a man named Silas Grayson, had been accused of witchcraft in the late 1800s. Rumors swirled that he'd made a pact with something dark, something otherworldly, to ensure the mill's success. When the workers rose against him, they thought they were ending his reign of terror. Instead, they unleashed something far worse. "The Tall One," Jacob murmured, tracing his finger over a faded sketch in one of the books. It was crude but unmistakably a figure with impossibly long limbs and a featureless void for a face. The text beneath the drawing was written in Latin. Roughly translated, it read, "He walks among us, unseen but ever present. His shadow binds the town, his curse eternal. To gaze upon him is to invite him in." Jacob and I stared at the Latin inscription, the weight of its meaning sinking in like stones tied to our ankles. "To gaze upon him is to invite him in," I murmured, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. My mind raced back to the mill, to that moment I had locked eyesore what should have been eyes with the tall one. Had I invited it in? Was that why it was following us? Jacob's face paled. "We're cursed now, aren't we?" I didn't answer because I didn't know. Instead, I flipped through the brittle pages of the book, searching for anything that might explain how to stop it. As the morning sun filtered through the library's dusty windows, exhaustion weighed heavily on us. Jacob's paranoia was palpable, his head snapping toward every creak and shadow, as if the tall one might materialize at any moment. I was no better. My skin prickled with an ever-present sense of being watched, even when the room was empty. We needed help. The waitress from the diner, what was her name? Maggie. She'd known about the tall one, warned me about it. Maybe she knew more. We found Maggie at the diner, wiping down tables with the grim determination of someone who didn't want to be disturbed. When she saw us, her shoulders sagged, and she shook her head. "You should have left when I told you to," she said, her voice tinged with resignation. "We didn't have a choice," I said. "It's following us." Her eyes darkened, and she gestured for us to sit. Lowering her voice, she leaned in close. "If it's following you, then you're already marked. There's no running from it. There has to be a way to stop it," I insisted. Maggie hesitated, glancing around the room before speaking. "There's a story, an old one. My grandmother used to tell it, but no one knows if it's true. They say the only way to break the tall one's hold is to destroy the place where it was born. The mill." Jacob's head shot up. "Burn it down?" Maggie nodded. "But it won't be easy. The tall one protects that place and anyone who's tried to destroy it." Her voice faltered, and she didn't need to finish the sentence. That night, armed with a plan born of desperation, Jacob and I gathered what we needed: gasoline, lighters, and enough courage to face whatever waited for us at the mill. The drive there was suffocatingly quiet, the kind of silence that amplifies every doubt and fear. The mill loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the night sky. As we stepped out of the car, the air grew colder, heavier, as though the ground itself resisted our presence. "Let's do this quickly," Jacob whispered, his voice trembling. We moved through the building like shadows, dousing the floors and walls with gasoline. The smell was sharp, almost nauseating, but it gave me a strange sense of purpose. Then, as I crouched to pour fuel around the base of a rusted machine, I heard it. A low, guttural hum. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. Jacob was on the other side of the room, his movements stilled by the same sound. It grew louder, resonating in the air, in my chest, until it became a deafening roar. The lights of my flashlight flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. And then it was there. The tall one emerged from the shadows, its impossible form towering over us. The gasoline can slip from my hands as my instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. It didn't rush toward us. It didn't need to. The air around it seemed to pulse with malice, rooting me to the spot. Jacob screamed. In that moment, something primal took over. I grabbed the lighter from my pocket, fumbling to ignite it as the tall one's presence bore down on me. The flames sputtered to life, and with a shaking hand, I dropped it into the pool of gasoline at my feet. The fire roared to life, spreading faster than I anticipated. The heat was immediate, blistering, but it gave me the clarity I needed to act. "Jacob, move!" I shouted, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward the exit. The fire consumed the mill with a ferocity that seemed almost unnatural, as though it had been waiting for this moment. But the tall one, it didn't burn. It stood there, motionless, as the flames danced around it. Its featureless face turned toward me one last time before it began to dissolve, its form unraveling into tendrils of shadow that were swallowed by the fire. We stumbled out into the night, coughing and gasping for air as the mill collapsed behind us. The fire illuminated the town in an eerie orange glow, and for a moment, the weight of the Tall One's presence lifted. But something in me knew it wasn't over. The next day, Fairfield felt different. The oppressive heaviness that had clung to the town seemed to have lifted, and yet, as I walked through the streets, I noticed the way people looked at me. They knew. Maggie confirmed it later that afternoon. "The mill's gone, but that doesn't mean it's over," she said. "You've severed its tether to the town, but now you've made yourself a part of its story." "What does that mean?" I asked, dreading the answer. She fixed me with a somber look. "The Tall One is gone from Fairfield, but it'll follow you now. And so here I am, telling you this story, maybe as a warning, or maybe just to unburden myself. I don't know where the Tall One is now, but sometimes, when the night is still, I feel it watching, waiting, and I wonder if burning the mill was a mistake." Small towns have always fascinated me. They hold secrets, their histories etched into the very foundation of their cobblestone streets and weathered homes. What people in these towns don't talk about is often more telling than what they do. My experience with such a town nun that I will never forget started with an innocent enough reason: research for my next book. I had been in the town of Maple Hollow for only a few days when things began to spiral out of control. It was a postcard-perfect place, nestled in a valley surrounded by dense forests. Maple Hollow had a single main street with a diner, a post office, a general store, and an old library. The people were friendly enough, though there was a subtle guardedness behind their smiles. I had come to Maple Hollow to write about its peculiar history. My publisher had suggested the idea after hearing about the mysterious disappearances that plagued the town over the years. Every 10 years, like clockwork, someone would vanish without a trace. The latest incident had occurred just a month ago, a teenage girl named Lily Harper. What intrigued me the most was the lack of media attention. It was as if the town had its own rules, a bubble that no one dared to pop. I started my research at the library. The building itself was ancient, its walls lined with books that looked as if they hadn't been touched in decades. The librarian, an older woman named Mrs. Crenshaw, seemed reluctant to help me at first. "You're wasting your time, you know," she said, her voice a whisper. "There's nothing in these books that'll tell you what you want to know." "What do you mean?" I asked, setting down a stack of dusty volumes. "Some stories aren't meant to be told," she said, her gaze flicking toward the windows as if she feared being overheard. That only made me more determined. My first breakthrough came when I stumbled upon an old journal hidden among the library's archives. It belonged to a man named Elias Grayson, who had lived in the town during the late 1800s. His entries detailed a chilling pattern of disappearances, eerily similar to the ones happening now. One entry, dated November 12, 1883, caught my eye. "The woods whisper at night. They call to those who hear, and those who answer never return. I saw it tonight, the shape in the trees. I dare not describe it, for fear it will come for me too." I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. Could this shape be connected to Lily Harper's disappearance? The next day, I visited the Harper family. Lily's parents were distraught but welcoming, desperate for answers. Her mother, Susan, showed me Lily's room, which they had kept untouched since her disappearance. "She loved drawing," Susan said, her voice trembling as she handed me a sketchbook. Flipping through the pages, I saw whimsical landscapes, portraits of friends, and then something that made my breath catch. It was a drawing of the woods, but there was a figure among the trees. It was tall, impossibly so, with elongated limbs and a featureless face. "She said she saw it the night before she disappeared," Susan whispered. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the figure haunted me, and Elias Grayson's words echoed in my mind. "I saw it tonight, the shape in the trees." I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The town was eerily quiet, the streets empty. As I passed the edge of the forest, I heard Ida faint whispering, so soft I almost thought I imagined it. Curiosity overpowered caution, and I stepped into the woods. The air was colder here, heavy with an unnatural stillness. The whispering grew louder, though I couldn't discern the words. My flashlight flickered, and then I saw it. A figure stood in the distance, just beyond the reach of my light. It was tall, its limbs unnaturally thin, and it seemed to blend into the shadows of the trees. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move. I took a step closer, and then it vanished, as if it had never been there. The next morning, I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Perhaps it was just my imagination, fueled by the eerie drawings and journal entries. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I returned to the library to see Mrs. Crenshaw. She took one look at me and shook her head. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she said. "I don't know what I saw," I admitted. Mrs. Crenshaw sighed and pulled out a small, leather-bound book from beneath the counter. "This isn't part of the library's collection," she said. "It's been passed down through generations, a record of what's happened in this town." The book was filled with accounts of the disappearances, each eerily similar to the last. The victims always reported seeing the figure in the woods before they vanished. One passage stood out. "It is a watcher, an ancient thing that hungers for something we cannot understand. It chooses its prey, marking them with its presence. Once marked, there is no escape." I left the library feeling more unsettled than ever. Was I marked? That night, as I sat in my motel room, the whispers returned. They were louder now, filling the air like a chorus of voices just out of reach. And then, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. I saw it. "I'm going inside." My blood ran cold. It was the exact message Lily Harper had sent before she disappeared. The whispers grew deafening, and the lights in my room flickered. The figure was outside my window now, its featureless face staring directly at me. I don't remember much after that, only darkness, and the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. When I woke up, I was in the woods. When I woke up in the woods, the world felt wrong. The air was too still, the trees too close, their crooked limbs clawing at the sky like desperate hands. My head throbbed, and a sharp, metallic taste lingered in my mouth. The first thing I noticed was the quiet and oppressive silence that seemed to swallow even my breathing. And then the whispers returned, faint and distant, as though the forest itself was murmuring secrets I wasn't meant to hear. I didn't remember how I had gotten there or how long I'd been unconscious. The only thing I knew was that I wasn't alone. I stood slowly, my legs trembling as if I were a marionette struggling against its strings. My flashlight was gone, and the feeble light of the moon barely penetrated the canopy above. "Hello?" I called out, my voice thin and fragile against the silence. The whispering stopped, and then I heard footsteps light and deliberate, crunching the leaves just out of sight. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice cracking. No answer. The footsteps circled me, deliberate and slow, as if whoever or whatever it was wanted me to know I was being watched. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to run. But where would I go? The woods stretched endlessly in every direction, their tangled paths twisting into darkness. And then I saw it. The figure stood at the edge of my vision, its impossibly tall frame silhouetted against the shadows. Its limbs were unnaturally long, and its head tilted to one side, as though it were studying me. I blinked, and it was gone. Panic set in as I stumbled through the woods, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispering began again, louder now, overlapping voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. They weren't random noises anymore. They were words. "This way. Follow. Don't look back." Against every rational thought, I obeyed. The voices led me to a clearing where the air felt heavier, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. In the center of the clearing was a stone circle, ancient and weathered. its surface carved with the same symbols I had seen in the library and Lily's sketchbook. The whispers fell silent, and then I heard a sound that froze me in place, a low, guttural growl. The figure appeared again, stepping into the clearing with an unnerving fluidity. Up close, it was worse than I had imagined. Its featureless face seemed to ripple like water, and its limbs bent at impossible angles as it moved. I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't obey. It was as if the ground itself had rooted me in place. The figure raised one impossibly long arm and pointed toward the stone circle. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "I'm not going in there." The growling grew louder, and the air around me seemed to compress, crushing the breath from my lungs. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I stepped into the circle. The moment my foot crossed the boundary, the forest vanished. I was standing in darkness, an endless void where time and space seemed meaningless. The whispers returned, louder now, their words incomprehensible, but filled with a malevolent intent. And then I saw them, shapes moving in the dark, dozens of them, their elongated forms flickering in and out of sight. They surrounded me, their presence suffocating, but none of them came closer. They were waiting for something. I turned, and there it was. The figure was no longer featureless. Its face now resembled mine, a grotesque parody of my own features twisted into a cruel grin. It raised a hand, and I felt an unbearable heat sear through my chest. Memories flooded my mind, moments I hadn't lived, faces I didn't recognize, voices screaming in languages I didn't understand. The sensation was overwhelming, as though the figure was pouring its existence into me, or perhaps taking something from me. When I woke again, I was lying on the side of the road, just outside Maple Hollow. The town was eerily quiet, its streets deserted. I stumbled into the diner, desperate for some semblance of normalcy, but it was empty. Plates of half-eaten food sat on the tables, as though everyone had vanished in the middle of their meal. I checked my phone. The date was a week later than I remembered. I drove out of Maple Hollow that day, determined to leave the nightmare behind, but the whispers followed me. They're quieter now, lurking at the edge of my hearing, but they never truly go away. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I see it, the figure standing at the foot of my bed, its face still wearing my own. And I know it's only a matter of time before it takes me back. There is a particular allure to small towns. They whisper of simpler times, of neighborly connections and timeless traditions. But for those who have truly wandered into the hearts of these towns, into their darkened alleyways, forgotten histories, and hidden corners, they know that there is another side. Small towns hold secrets as deep and dark as any abyss. I learned this lesson firsthand in the quiet, unassuming village of Blackwater. The name Blackwater first came to me through an email from an anonymous sender. Looking for a story? It began. Blackwater has one to tell. A cryptic note followed, mentioning a local legend of disappearances tied to something called the Wailing Grove. No address, no sign-off, just coordinates. As a storyteller, I live for moments like these, breadcrumbs of mystery leading to potentially buried treasure. I had been on the road for months, traveling and collecting tales for a new book, and though the email reeked of a prank, I couldn't resist. After all, the greatest stories often begin with the smallest leaps of faith. The drive to Blackwater was long, the town hidden deep in a forested pocket of Appalachia. The GPS struggled to keep its bearings, and the final 20 miles were nothing more than a dirt road weaving between towering trees. By the time I saw the wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Blackwater," the sun was already dipping below the horizon. The town was smaller than I had expected, just a scattering of homes, a few aging businesses, and a church that looked ready to collapse under its own weight. It had the air of a place that the modern world had passed by, untouched by time, but also by progress. A heavy fog hung in the streets, adding an eerie touch to an already surreal setting. The only accommodation was a boarding house called the Hollow Hearth, a weathered Victorian with sagging porches and shuttered windows. The woman who greeted me introduced herself as Mrs. Thorne, her thin frame wrapped tightly in a shawl that seemed as old as the house itself. "You're here for the grove," she said the moment I stepped inside. Her words froze me in place. "The grove?" She nodded, her eyes sharp and watchful. "Everyone who comes here has heard the stories. It's best you don't linger there after dark." Before I could press her further, she handed me a key with an etched brass tag that read, "Room 4. Breakfast is at dawn. Stay in after sundown. This town sleeps early, and so should you." By morning, I had gathered just enough courage to begin my investigation. Mrs. Thorne's words lingered in my mind, but curiosity outweighed caution. I asked a few townsfolk about the grove, but most responded with tight-lipped dismissals or sidelong glances that said far more than words ever could. It was only the local pastor, a wiry man named Caleb, who offered me any real information. "The Wailing Grove is an old patch of woods on the edge of town," he said, his voice low. "People say it's cursed always has been. They hear crying from the trees, see lights that don't belong to this world, and some who wander in don't wander back out." "Do you believe the stories?" I asked. Caleb hesitated. "Belief isn't important. What matters is that every story starts somewhere. Blackwater started with a fire." He went on to tell me about the Blackwater Foundling Home, an orphanage that had once stood on the land where the grove now grew. It burned down more than a century ago, killing most of the children and staff. The townsfolk claimed to hear their screams long after the fire was gone, and over the years, the forest reclaimed the land. "Some say the children never left," Caleb finished. "Others say something worse took their place." By late afternoon, I found myself standing at the edge of the grove. The woods stretched before me like a wall of shadow. The trees twisted and gnarled, as though shaped by agony. A weathered sign stood nearby, its paint long faded, but the words still legible. "No trespassing. Town Ordinance 43. Ignoring the warning, I stepped past the sign. The air inside the grove was thick and oppressive, the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums. The deeper I went, the darker it became, as though the trees themselves were conspiring to block out the light. The path narrowed, lined with roots that seemed to reach out like skeletal fingers. And then I heard Ida's faint, high-pitched wail, so soft I almost convinced myself it was the wind. But as I ventured farther, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just a cry, it was a chorus of them, overlapping and echoing like the pleas of the damned. The rational part of my mind tried to explain it away: animals, perhaps, or the distant sounds of the town, but deep down, I knew better. The path ended at a clearing, its center dominated by an ancient oak tree. Its trunk was massive, its branches sprawling like veins across the sky. Strange symbols were carved into its bark, their edges weathered but still discernible. Beneath the tree lay a mound of stones. As I approached, the crying stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. I felt the hairs on my neck rise, a primal warning I couldn't ignore. And then I saw Ida's figure standing just beyond the tree, half hidden in the shadows. It was small, no taller than a child, but its proportions were wrong. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its limbs were impossibly thin. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it began to move toward me, its gait jerky and disjointed like a marionette on tangled strings. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the altar. The figure stopped abruptly, its head snapping to the side as though listening to something I couldn't hear, and then it vanished. I ran. The woods seemed to close in around me, the trees shifting and twisting as though trying to trap me. By the time I burst back into the open air, my lungs were burning and my hands were trembling. Back at the hollow hearth, Mrs. Thorne was waiting for me. She said nothing as I staggered inside, but the look in her eyes told me she knew exactly where I had been. "You shouldn't have gone there," she said after a long silence. "The grove doesn't let people go so easily." I tried to explain what I had seen, but the words felt inadequate, my mind struggling to reconcile the impossible with reality. Mrs. Thorne listened quietly before handing me a small, leather-bound book. "This belonged to one of the orphans," she said. "Read it if you dare. But be warned, some truths are worse than ignorance." The diary was old, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. The entries were written in a child's handwriting, uneven and scrawled, but the words sent chills down my spine. June 3, 1874. Miss Emily says the woods are dangerous, but I saw her go there last night. She didn't come back until morning. Her dress was torn, and she looked scared. June 7, 1874. Tommy heard the crying again. He says it's the devil, but I don't think so. It sounds more like a baby. June 15, 1874. Miss Emily is gone. The grown-ups say she ran away, but I think the woods took her. Tommy says we should make an offering so they don't take us too. The entries grew darker, detailing rituals the children had performed to appease whatever dwelled in the grove. The final entry was scrawled in frantic, almost illegible handwriting. July 4, 1874. The fire started after the altar broke. They are angry. They are coming. That night, I dreamed of the grove. The cries echoed in my mind, pulling me deeper into the woods. The altar was there, the stones glowing faintly in the darkness, and then I saw them, the children. Their faces were pale and gaunt, their eyes empty voids. They reached for me, their mouths moving in silent pleas. I woke drenched in sweat, the faint sound of crying still echoing in my ears. By morning, I knew I couldn't leave. Not yet. Something had been awakened, and it wouldn't rest until the truth was uncovered. The world often forgets places like Briarwood, a small town tucked away in the forgotten folds of the Midwest. I had stumbled upon it by accident, so I thought at the time. What I've come to believe since is that some places call to us, even if we don't hear their voices until it's too late. I was driving cross-country, chasing a thread of folklore for a book I was working on. The road signs had all but vanished in the unmarked rural stretches, and the GPS on my phone had given up, replaced by a blank gray screen. The sun had just set, spilling a blood-red glow across the horizon before the night swallowed it whole. My headlights cut through the darkness, revealing the occasional deer or broken fence post, but no other signs of life. When I saw the sign for Briarwood, I breathed a sigh of relief. The gas gauge had been hovering dangerously close to empty, and the thought of spending the night stranded in my car on some desolate road wasn't appealing. I followed the narrow road into the heart of the town, a scattering of buildings that seemed to huddle together against the vastness of the surrounding fields. The town looked frozen in time, as though it had fallen asleep sometime in the 1950s and never woken up. A gas station stood at the edge of town, its pumps worn and rusted but still functional. I pulled in, expecting to see someone behind the counter of the attached convenience store. The interior was dimly lit, and the only sound was the faint hum of a refrigerator in the back. No one was there. I called out, my voice echoing eerily in the small space. Just as I turned to leave, a man emerged from a door behind the counter. He was middle-aged, with deep-set eyes and a tired expression. His name tag read, Charlie. "Passing through?" he asked, his voice carrying the faintest hint of suspicion. "Yeah," I replied, handing him a few bills. "Looking for a place to stay for the night. Is there a motel around here?" He hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the window as though checking for someone or something outside. "Briarwood Inn down the main street," he said finally. "But listen, stranger, if you're smart, you'll keep to yourself tonight. This town's got rules." "Rules?" I asked, frowning. "You'll see," he said, handing me my change and turning back through the door before I could press him further. The Briarwood Inn wasn't much to look at, a squat brick building with peeling paint and a flickering neon vacancy sign. The woman at the front desk, a wiry figure with a head of graying hair, barely looked at me as she handed over a room key. "Room 12, she said, then added in a low voice, "Don't go out after dark." Before I could ask her what she meant, She shuffled away into the back room. The room was clean but plain, with a single bed, a small desk, and a window that looked out onto the empty street. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that had been growing since I'd arrived. Maybe it was just the isolation, or the way the townsfolk seemed to carry some unspoken burden. Either way, I decided to get some sleep and head out first thing in the morning. But sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of faint music. It was distant but melodic, carrying an ethereal quality that sent shivers down my spine. I got up and went to the window, pulling the curtain aside. The street was deserted, yet the music seemed to be coming from somewhere nearby. Curiosity got the better of me. Ignoring the warnings I'd received, I grabbed my coat and stepped outside. The air was colder than I'd expected, carrying a sharp, biting edge. The music grew louder as I followed it, winding my way through the empty streets. It led me to the center of town, where a large, dilapidated building loomed against the night sky. The sign above the door read, "The Orpheum." It looked like an old theater, its once grand facade now crumbling with age. The music seemed to pour from within, its haunting melody calling to me. I pushed open the heavy doors and stepped inside. The lobby was dimly lit, the faint glow of chandeliers casting long shadows across the cracked marble floor. Dust hung in the air, swirling in the beams of light that streamed through broken windows. The music was louder now, emanating from the main auditorium. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to leave, but something about the music held me in its grip, pulling me forward. I pushed open the doors to the auditorium and froze. The seats were filled not with people, but with figures. They were humanoid but wrong, their forms shrouded in darkness that seemed to writhe and pulse. They sat motionless, their faces turned toward the stage, where a lone pianist played a grand piano. His back was to me, but I could see the way his hands moved over the keys with impossible speed and precision. The music was intoxicating, a blend of beauty and despair that made my chest tighten. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, though I couldn't say why. I tried to step back, but my legs refused to move. Then the pianist stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Slowly, he turned to face me, and my blood ran cold. His face was pale and featureless, save for two hollow voids where his eyes should have been. "Why have you come?" he asked, his voice reverberating through the empty hall. I stammered, my mind racing for an answer. "I heard the music. You shouldn't be here," he said. "This place is not for the living." I wanted to run, but his gazier, the absence of eye, held me in place. The figures in the seats began to stir, their forms unraveling like smoke. They rose as one, turning toward me with an unnatural grace. "You have trespassed," the pianist said, his voice colder now. "And now you must pay the price." Before I could react, the figures surged forward, their shadowy forms enveloping me. I felt their cold touch, their whispered voices filling my mind with fragments of sorrow and despair. I screamed, the sound swallowed by the darkness. When I woke, I was lying in the middle of the street outside the Orpheum. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting its warm light over the town. The building was gone, replaced by an empty lot overgrown with weeds. I stumbled back to the inn, my body aching and my mind reeling. The woman at the front desk looked at me with a mixture of pity and resignation. "You went to the Orpheum, didn't you?" she said softly. It wasn't real," I stammered. "It couldn't have been." She shook her head. "It's real enough. The Orpheum shows up every now and then, calling to those who don't belong here. It's a warning to leave before it's too late." I didn't need to be told twice. I packed my things and left Breerwood that morning, vowing never to return. Even now, I can still hear the faint strains of that haunting melody in my dreams. Some nights, I wake to find myself humming it without realizing, and though I've tried to forget, I know that some part of me will always belong to that cursed place. Because once you've heard the music of the Orpheum, it never really leaves you. It was early October, just as the air began to chill and the leaves started their descent into vibrant reds and oranges. I had been invited to a small, seemingly idyllic town nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains. The town's name was Whispering Hollow, and its reputation as a hidden gem for travelers seeking tranquility had intrigued me. However, the true reason for my visit was far from a leisurely escape. I had been tipped off by an old friend, a fellow storyteller, that Whispering Hollow had a dark, unsettling history. Over the years, stories of inexplicable disappearances, sightings of shadowy figures, and eerie sounds in the night had trickled out of the town. The locals were notoriously tight-lipped, preferring to keep their secrets buried. For me, though, the prospect of uncovering the truth was irresistible. I arrived just before dusk, driving my beat-up old SUV along winding roads that seemed to lead deeper and deeper into a world untouched by time. The town came into view, its quaint cottages and cobblestone streets looking like something out of a fairy tale. The setting sun cast long shadows over the place, giving it a surreal, almost dreamlike quality. I had booked a room at the only inn in town, a creaky old building called the Whispering Hearth. Its owner, a gaunt man named Elias, greeted me with a nod and handed me a brass key without asking many questions. His eyes, though, seemed to linger on me, as if trying to gauge my intentions. "The nights here are different," Elias said cryptically as I turned to leave. "Keep your windows locked and your curtains drawn." I chalked it up to small-town superstition, but his words clung to me like a fog as I made my way to my room. After settling in, I ventured out to explore. The streets were eerily quiet, the only sounds being the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. I passed by the local diner, its neon sign flickering weakly, and a small general store that seemed frozen in time. A few locals nodded in my direction but offered no smiles. I found myself drawn to the outskirts of town, where the houses gave way to dense woods. There, perched on a hill, stood an old, dilapidated mansion. It was the kind of place that seemed to breathe its own air of menace. "That's the Holloway house," a voice said behind me, making me jump. I turned to see a woman in her late 60s, her face lined with age, but her eyes sharp and curious. "Used to belong to the Holloway family. They were big around here once, but that place has been empty for years. Some say it's cursed." "Cursed?" I asked. My curiosity piqued. She hesitated before answering. "They say, if you go there at night, you'll hear whispers, voices that ain't supposed to be there. People who go looking for them, they don't always come back." Before I could ask more, she walked away, leaving me with a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. That night, I couldn't sleep. The town was too quiet, and the stillness felt oppressive. Remembering the woman's words, I decided to investigate the Holloway house. Armed with a flashlight and my recording equipment, I slipped out of the inn and made my way through the deserted streets. The mansion loomed ahead, its broken windows like empty eye sockets staring into the night. The gate was rusted but unlocked, and the path leading up to the house was overgrown with weeds. As I approached, I could feel the air grow heavier, as if the house itself was aware of my presence. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of mildew. My footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, each creak sounding louder than the last. The flashlight's beam danced across faded wallpaper, broken furniture, and scattered debris. And then I heard Ita faint whisper. I froze, holding my breath. The sound was soft but unmistakable, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. Slowly, I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. It led me to a staircase, its steps groaning under my weight. At the top of the stairs, the whispers grew louder, mingling with what sounded like faint sobbing. I entered a room that appeared to have been a child's bedroom. A broken crib lay in one corner, and faded drawings adorned the walls. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The whispers were all around me now, overlapping voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The temperature dropped sharply, my breath visible in the icy air. And then I saw Ita's figure standing in the corner. It was barely more than a shadow, its form flickering like a dying flame. Two glowing eyes stared at me, filled with malice. "Leave," a guttural voice growled, shaking the very walls of the room. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted for the door, wrenching it open and nearly tripping over my own feet as I raced down the stairs. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more frantic, until I was out of the house and back on the path. When I reached the inn, I locked the door to my room and collapsed onto the bed, my mind racing. I tried to rationalize what I had experienced, but no amount of logic could explain what I had seen and heard. The next morning, I decided to confront Elias. When I described what had happened, his face went pale. "You shouldn't have gone there," he said. "The Holloway family, they were into things they shouldn't have been. Dark things. That house is a scar on this town, and it doesn't like to be disturbed." I left Whispering Hollow that same day. My curiosity sated, but my nerves frayed. Even now, I can't shake the memory of those whispers or the shadowy figure in the corner. Some stories I've learned are better left untold. But as a storyteller, I can't help but share them even if they leave me haunted.